Hello, this is a look at critical race theory. Henry Louis Gates made the statement, what importance does race have as a meaningful category in the study of literature and the shaping of critical theory? Hopefully, as we go through here, you'll see that it's definitely something we ought to be taking a look at. What is critical race theory? Delgado, who is the godfather of movement, said it began in law and it spread beyond that discipline. Today, we see critical race theory used in law, of course, education, social sciences, within the field of literature. Some of the things we ought to note about it is that it has a historical piece to it, linguistic, and comparative factors that we can notice along the way. Oftentimes with CRT, it would deal with ways that white European culture had disparaged others who have differences. Oftentimes there is an implied racist nature to it. Not always, but oftentimes. Delgado gave a definition that race theory movement's a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. Some people would add law to that as well. But it sprang up in the mid-1970s, grew out of the civil rights movement of the 60s. And in literature, we'll often see how people historically use race to hold power over others through language used in describing people. Whenever the movement first begun, there were a number of students who were in a law class, about 150 students. 4 of them were people of color, and they realized that something was missing in this class that people needed to understand better. And this idea of critical race theory started to evolve during that time period. Critical race theory, it's really hard to pinpoint as to one specific idea that it is. There are 3 different ways that I kind of looked at critical race theory and studying it. One, you see a number of examples that do with one person being made lesser than another through race. And historical examples are given. Modern day examples are also given. A second thing that happens in the theory is finding the proper aesthetics and the way to evaluate writing using critical race theory. What's the best way to assess writing? And sometimes they talk about this idea of blackness and authentic blackness within the study. And there's also a piece that really looks at the humanness of the person and the identity of people instead of just having the focus on race. Henry Gates is mentioned often in the studies and looking at different pieces, and he did a lot of writing with it. But he mentions over time how the goal was to undermine Black people from writing. He uses examples in slave narrative and how a person would be kept down because they couldn't read or write. And Gates gives the idea that social mobility could happen with reading and writing. But these slave narratives often show that the person never had that opportunity. Those that did were able to have better understanding of where their place was in society and that they had a chance to move beyond it. This idea of social mobility was still a problem even for the educated. Phyllis Wheatley is known as being one of the great poets that we have in our country, an African-American lady from 1773. But she wrote this book of poetry, had to be published in London, couldn't be published in the United States. But a way that she was kept down was that after publishing it, she had to prove that she was educated enough to write this and that she was capable of producing such works. This is still a way of keeping a person down, even a person who had gained the opportunity to show that they were that they had moved to this different level, and that African American people were capable of writing in such a way. Gates looks at this idea of blackness as a physical concept instead of blackness as a metaphysical concept. And that is something that comes about within the studies of critical race theory, not looking just at the person and being descriptive at the person and being disparaging because of who a person is, but looking at the person and who they are and what makes them tick. These types of things is really where the person ought to be judged. And Gates also acknowledges this comes from the civil rights movement. He looked at literature, and some people looked that there had to be a blackness or a black aesthetic to the literature. Was this really important? Did this need to have a criticism? Is it appropriate for critical race theory? Again, that's an idea that continues to come out within the study. And he also mentions that CRT cannot be afraid to have a sustained, sophisticated verbal analysis to it. We can that literature of African Americans had to be willing to be judged as other literature was as well. Kwame Appiah, he goes through a huge piece in looking at how literature throughout time has down-based, not throughout time, but beginning in the 19th century, rather, has brought down people. He mentioned that in the Bible, classical Greeks, and Shakespeare, there were people who were noted as having differences, but the differences were not held against that person. Appiah begins his studies and looking with the 19th century how these ideas really hold people down. He uses examples in Ivanhoe, Salambo, and in the Leatherstocking Tales. With the way a person is being described, it kept a person as being a lesser instead of being an equal. He traces this to the concepts of a growing new world, where races from the Americas and Africa and Europe all started to intermingle and have interactions. And by that time, it had started to continue to trace down to literature by the 19th century. He also mentions the Enlightenment, where these people who are supposed to know all these things still denied literary capacity to people of African descent. And then that becomes to come out in writing in the 19th century. Michael Awkward, he continued arguing with Gates, where he mentioned how what's the best way to interpret Black literature. He had a focus on Black women's literature, where sometimes people didn't want to be critical to what was being written. And Awkward argues that if we are going to be taken seriously, we need to allow people to be critical of our literature as well, and that we can not only have people who are similar to us being the ones who are the evaluators or the critiquers of the literature. And he gives an example of a Black female writer who thought criticism shouldn't take place. So we can see with critical race theory, there are many forms and different ways of applying the theory that can make it difficult studying it, but it also gives the opportunity to apply the theory in many different ways as well. So when I was looking, I looked in literary theory and in linguistics. Literary theory is my field. And in linguistics, I looked at two different articles here, Performing Blackness and then Blackness of Broken English. Both dealt with different forms of speaking and looking at, the word that is used and how it's pronounced, the pronunciation and things like this. Performing Blackness dealt with movies and the way that African American English was being used. And then Broken English looked at the hip hop in Nigeria, something called Nigerian Pidgin. So in Performing Blackness, it goes back to the days of blackface, where obviously that was used in a sometimes supposed to be a comical but a disparaging way that we can see today in making a person a lesser or different than someone else. Well, today it's come full circle with some of these movies where some of these people who come from a white European background are speaking an African American dialect or a tone in their speaking, and it's not in a way that is uplifting, but it's a way that's disparaging and a way that's to be critical. The way it was used in the movies. And you could tell that it was downcasting to another group of people. Now, Broken English mentioned how Nigerian Pidgin which is a form of English and Nigerian, and then some of the other African languages that are used in Nigeria, how it's used to bring people together, and how it's created this commonality among people. So there are some ways that this critical race theory it can be an uplifting piece for people at times as well. But with looking at the linguistics, it was evident that precise language is certainly important. The specific example of the language and how it's broken down was seen within this film, and you could see that with the films or the songs. And when the language was used, you could also see the exact pronunciation of the word and how it might be said. For example, an ask or an ax. Someone something. So those are some of the different pieces that they looked at within these articles, and how the linguistics was tearing down or building up. Now, in literary theory, I looked at postmodern blackness and appropriating blackness. Postmodern blackness dealt with writing of Toni Morrison, and appropriating blackness looked at the writing of Riggs, the poetry of Riggs. Numerous examples were given with analysis, which is what we often see in literary theory, where examples are given and then analysis is given to explain a person's point. Now, something that seemed to stick out with literary theory is that other theories often seem to be evident within the text as well. And there is also the question of dealing with race and dealing with blackness and the best way to handle some of those types of things. So there are theories that you can see that were evident in both of these works. Postmodernism specifically was in both of them. That doesn't mean postmodernism is with all critical race theory. It just happened to be that way in these two. In Appropriating Blackness, it was a book. I was able to look at a couple of chapters within it, and that's what was mentioned within these chapters. But the idea of the African American presence and how the African American deals with different things was important with examples that were given. For example, if you take a look at the third example here, it says the concern was that real history was being replaced by historicism. So Davis, she mentions how sometimes historicism would change maybe what was going on in the African American community, and there was afraid that maybe it was shading some of critical race theory. And the article really gets into how postmodernism, which is kind of a wide idea, is reshaping some things within the African American community. But these are all different examples given by Davis, and then her analysis that is given. Now, over on the right hand side, we see with Johnson, it mentions some of the authentic blackness. And if you take a look at the fourth example there, it says Riggs, who is the poet who died, he undermines the idea that authentic blackness belongs to the black working class. And there was a whole discussion on what exactly makes you authentic. Riggs writes kind of a hip hop type of poetry. And is it a poetry of the street? Can it be a poetry of a person who has that street toughness? Riggs was a gay black man who died of AIDS. And does he have an authentic black story to tell? Is really what kind of came up with some of these writings, or do you just have to have this one kind of place to be? And so these are some ideas that come up within critical race theory. And Riggs continued on with like a code of silence. You didn't express your feelings in the black community. Was that right? Was that wrong? Could it be different in other places, in suburban areas and urban areas, or just the way of the streets? So these are some ideas that continue to come up and think about within critical race theory. So again, I would say that critical race theory is an evolving theory. It deals a lot with history, being authentic, race, identity of people. It's mainly a theory within the African American community, but it does, as you can see with the Nigerian pigeon, go over into Africa, into Europe. So then it becomes part of the black community. But other other peoples are starting to be brought into critical race theory as well. So thank you for listening about critical race theory. Here are some of the different pieces of the bibliography.